I'm Chris Carter of the Locked On Steelers podcast. Now that I'm back from the NFL Combine, I'm going to give you some of my top thoughts and why maybe the Steelers draft priorities look a little different right now. More on that here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things in the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day, because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more right now. New customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. All right, let's us get started here. As you can see, I'm back home after the combine. It was a long, fun, hard-working week. A lot of things going on, but we're back here, and we're going to be combing things over with a lot of the details. I got a lot of clips. We'll get into them as the weeks come by, because we're kind of studying all the players, but we got a lot of good information. And I want to talk about what we've been talking about the draft priorities to be. Now, I think it's still very similar, but there were some amazing performances in the combine as far as the events. And now that we're starting to get a sense of the athletic field out there, I do think it could end up shifting things. Now, we've been saying that the three positions for a while now, the Steelers probably are going to target in the first round are center with the obvious need, offensive tackle, and cornerback. So with those three positions, you're like, okay, and we've talked about Jackson Powers Johnson or Zach Frazier or Marius Mims or J.C. Latham or Cooper DeJean, whatever your flow is there. We've gone over that at least in a little bit on this show. And while I still think it's the case that I still think that's the case, the offensive tackles and the cornerbacks blew up the combine. Like there were several good things that you saw from both of those groups, and several players who showed why this is being considered in a great class for those two positions. Several cornerbacks showed a great mix of speed and explosiveness, and I think there's going to be clear options for teams to pick players well into the third round who could challenge as starters this year. So I think that was a very good sign. And the Steelers do need to find cornerbacks for the future. Several offensive tackles also showed how massive they are, how strong they are, while also being explosive and athletic and doing well in the tests. There's a lot of good things there. Now, the one thing I think that could be interesting for what the Steelers need right now is that they need a center. The two top centers at the top of the board, Jackson Powers Johnson and Zach Frazier, didn't do events. Well, and injuries play the part of that, and that's certainly that. And injury history is fine, but it doesn't mean the center's off the board. But I look at how well these other classes performed, and I mean, it makes me look like, man, like you got to be some Dermontti Dawson, Marquise Pouncey type center if you're going to take them over some of these guys with the raw athleticism they bring and some of the tape that they bring and the physicality they bring to the tackle position. And I think it does call into question, like, especially with what the Steelers are going to need to do without Mason Cole, they're probably going to need to sign a free agent center. Not probably, I think they are going to sign a free agent center. And if they sign one that's decent, would they draft another guy who a center in the first round? That's becoming a harder sell, especially when we're seeing how good some of these other classes are. And it's always tough for me, way early in the draft process. That's why when people ask me, like, during the season, what do you think about this? I'm not even looking at the draft. And so, like, when the season ends, that's when I've taken some, like, very light notes going into the end of the season. When the season ends and I start diving into the draft class, I'm like, okay, this is who these guys are. And then we start to get like an idea of things. And then the combine happens and pro days happen. And then usually by early April is when I'm usually confident about how I feel about this group. But while I said the corners and the offensive tackles, blew up the combine, the group that really blew up the combine was the wide receivers. They exploded. It wasn't just, what was it, Xavier Worthy, who ran a 4.21 40-yard dash, the fastest ever in the combine's history. It wasn't just him. There were a lot of great numbers across the board. Even a guy that we've been talking about, a potential Steelers target, Roman Wilson. He's been a sharp route runner. They liked him at the Senior Bowl. They liked him in a lot of different things. He ran a 4.39. That's really fast. There were several players. In fact, I'm pulling up the combine results here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 players ran under a 4.4 in this, and there were about 3 more that ran just outside of, just a hair outside of a 4.4 speed, or 4.4 flat. By the way, we're talking about there. That's a lot of speed, and I mean, these are also talented guys. These aren't the middling guys in the back of the pack that they just ran really fast and they don't have all the skills. These were people like Ladd McConkey, like Brian Thomas Jr., like Adonai Mitchell, like Xavier Leggett, like Ricky Pearsall. All of them were either under 4.4 flat or right around 4.4 flat, and that's really, really good. And that, I think that's where you look at the Steelers situation and say, man, that's tough. That's tough to ignore. And I think that when you look at that and the skill set that this receiver group has, it makes you wonder, where do you get your receiver in this class? Because if you can get one of those guys who can pair long term with George Pickens, or potentially even be a guy that, if you like them more than George Pickens in 2 to 3 years' time, when you got to make a decision to pay George Pickens, that maybe you'll find also some compensation for him. I think this is a great year to look at the talent in the wide receiver room. And I said it before, I think that, hey, if they got one in the 4th round, I think they'd be good. I've been talking about guys like Malachi Corley of Western Kentucky, who, again, I still think is pretty good. I've been talking about Javon Baker, from Central Florida, Malik Washington of Virginia, all sorts of guys like that, they're not going to go in the first 2 rounds of these. I don't think so right now. But guys who I think could work out and be guys there. I'm getting the sense that the Steelers want to go after and get some of these guys in the earlier rounds. Troy Franklin from Oregon, another one. And I think it makes a little bit more sense than some people believe, because some people are like, you got to do offensive line. You got to do corner. Why would you do receiver? I think there's more merit to this. And it doesn't mean that those other positions aren't a priority. They are. They're going to be all part of this process. But I think with the skills that we saw in the combine from all the receivers, on top of the speed that they're possessing, I do think that plus when we look at who the Steelers took visits with at the combine, and who they've already looked at the Senior Bowl, there's some suggestions there that maybe wide receiver is a much bigger part of their plans for the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd rounds. We'll get to more of that here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We still have a lot to discuss, and Mock Draft Monday right after this. But first, I want to remind you this show is sponsored by FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America, where there's always great chances to win. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet made on FanDuel. If you're like me, football season being done doesn't mean I'm done with sports. FanDuel gives you so many ways to play, with NBA, NHL, college basketball, and so much more action available to you right at your fingertips. If you download the FanDuel app on your phone today, as you can also go on their websites. And when you go to FanDuel, you'll see there's so many different ways for you to pick up W's. When you're looking at FanDuel, you can go on your phone, check, you can search it. You can find quick bets, live same game parlays, make exclusive prop bets, and find the best bets that you think are going to work out for you. New customers, join today and you get $150 back in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. So that, again, FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our discussion as I'm back here after the combine, first episode afterwards. We were talking about the wide receivers, right? And we were talking about how this class could be too good to pass up and how and what kind of stuff they bring. The Steelers are also making it clear that they're interested in some of these top guys. If you look at it, some of the names that are here that we're seeing them with combine visits: Brian Thomas out of LSU, Troy Franklin out of Oregon, Adonai Mitchell out of Texas, and now Ian Rappaport is also added to that list. Rome Odunze from Washington, the guy that Michael Penix was throwing to, who he's a guy I saw in the regular season. I was like, oh my goodness, he's gonna go top 10. And you're seeing that. To me, that's a wow development. Like, I even tweeted it when Brian Thomas, at LSU said, "Oh yeah, I've met with the Steelers and gave his." I was like, they okay, I guess they're doing that. They're interested because it doesn't mean that they're committed to picking wide receiver in round 1 or anything like that. But those are guys that are projected to go in the first round. And I think that, we've been saying, hey, again, 4th round, maybe even 3rd round, you can see that there, but not in this kind of conversation, especially because, and I know some of you guys are out there pounding your tables, listening to this or watching this and saying, like, there's so many other needs. Cornerback, you need to find Joey Porter Jr.'s partner. Offensive tackle, you got to get the guy, you got to get Dan Moore out of the starting lineup. Center, you just got rid of Mason Cole, and he wasn't good in the first place for most of this season. Linebacker, you hurt up all over there. Defensive line, you need to get younger with Keanu Benton and get ready for a future without Cam Hayward in a couple years. And then also even safety, because you didn't like what you saw from DeMonte Casey and Keanu Neal. There's so many positions. Why get wide receiver 1 where you have Deontay Johnson still locked up under 1 more year of a deal, George Pickens 2 more years of his rookie deal, Calvin Austin 2 more years of his rookie. Like, there's potential there. Why go after that? Well, don't forget, as we said multiple times on the show, and if you're one of the people that pays attention to rumor mills and things like that, Deontay Johnson, who we've been saying for quite a bit, makes sense as a trade bait target for the Steelers to dangle out there. He's in the last year of his contract. He's the guy who, hasn't been too detrimental to the team. I think he's been better too. I think like everyone kind of sees it, but I think that if you want to find a way to recoup some draft comps or some draft picks or, for him that could help you out this year, it would make sense. And especially with this wide receiver class, and maybe George Pickens is your wide receiver 1, while while you look bring in a rookie, you have maybe a veteran like we said, Tyler Boyd, and then you still have Calvin Austin. There's room for that's a room right there. And it doesn't mean that Deontay Johnson is going to get traded or will be traded or anything like that. But again, Pickens becomes wide receiver 1. You get Austin behind. You get Calvin Austin behind him after that, and then a vet wide receiver. That adds up. Now, there's some of these players that we're talking about, like Rome Odunze. Steelers ain't never getting him. He ain't falling that far. I don't care what nobody says. That's one of those moves where Mike Tomlin and the Steelers are doing their due diligence to make sure that they're talking to some of the top players out there, because the Steelers know that with their traditional position of picking, they don't get to pick the top guys at the top of the draft. Just rarely happens. But you never know when the teams that did pick them become a little disappointed. And they're like, you know what? We're going to trade them away. Or being one of those types of teams. I think the Steelers, that's one thing they bet. Like that's what they did with Minkah Fitzpatrick, right? They knew they couldn't draft him, but they made sure to interview him. They developed a good relationship. So then when Minkah Fitzpatrick was looking for a trade partner, the Steelers were right there. They had a relationship, and things worked out well. I think that's part of what the Rome Odunze is. But these other guys, like Brian Thomas, that's a legit guy. I think that's kind of interesting to see that they're putting this much emphasis into that specific position. And listen, there's also, again, really good at cornerback and really good at talent at offensive tackle. We're seeing all 3 of these groups do well in the combine, and I think that's where if the Steelers right now, their top priority, they want to fix the offensive line. Yes, they want to get better in the secondary. Yes, they want to do all sorts of things. But the Steelers' top priority, I think, is building this new young core that they began putting together to be the central piece of what they want to build to get back into being real playoff contenders, not just contenders who make the playoffs, but contenders that when they're in the playoffs, they a problem. That's where I think the Steelers are going with right now. And some of that is, actually getting the players on the field who are going to do that. And I think also that's going to be, drafting guys. Last year, they drafted guys who did that. Broderick Jones when he began starting for the Steelers in week 10 permanently, you saw the numbers jump up. I think that there's opportunities there for, guys like Keanu Benton and Joey Porter Jr. last year. If the Steelers can find top end talents who you want to bring them in. And so I think that that's where the Steelers, they're looking at that, and everything I'm seeing and I'm looking at these classes tells me more and more, maybe center isn't the first round move. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be, doesn't mean it won't be. But I'm saying I'm coming around to that when I'm looking at the measurables while they think. And who knows, maybe these guys have pro days that just rock my socks off. I'm like, okay, all right. I'm back on the train of picking a center in the first round. But just looking at some of the talent here, corner, tackle, wide receiver, there's a lot of guys who I think, at least measurables wise and everything else was, look like first round picks. And the Steelers only got one of them. So I think that there's plenty of space to argue of where they're going to take a player. But I think it's going to be really interesting over the next several weeks to see what ends up becoming free agency. What's the main target? What's the main goal? How do they build off of that? All that will be very interesting to watch, and we'll discuss that more when we get into in depth on a lot of these players. Again, I took lots of video of talking to these guys, but I wanted to take some time when I got back to splice them up for the parts that I think can be interesting to talk about, some of their strengths and some of their weaknesses and what they brought to what they bring to the table for whoever ends up taking them. We'll get into all that in the coming weeks as we move along here from the combine. But right after this break, it's Mock Draft Monday time. So we start getting into your Mock Draft Mondays. You all submitted picks. We'll show you who won the picks in Mock Draft Monday right after this. But first, I want to remind you this episode is brought to you by BetterHelp Therapy Online. What's the first thing that you do if you had an extra hour in your day? Maybe you'd go for a run. Maybe you'd read a book. Maybe you just be there for a friend. But what about taking that time to just be there for yourself? That's where a good therapist can come in for you and be very, very important and helpful for you, because therapy can help you find what matters to you and helps you organize your life so that you can do more of it. I benefited from a good therapist in my life, and then helped me sort through so many important things to make it so I have a better balance in my day-to-day life. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp knows life can be busy and stressful, so it's designed to be suitable for your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime with no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our show here as we get ready to reveal our Mock Draft Monday winner. First, I want to just shout out everyone who participates in Mock Draft Mondays. You guys give me so many options to pick from, and it makes it easier to kind of diversify what kind of looks we're looking at here. We'll do that more and more as we get closer to the draft, looking at different things. But again, I want to thank everyone participating. If you ever want to play on Mock Draft Monday, all you have to do is find my Twitter account at Carter Critiques. You can go to the Locked On Steelers Facebook group, and you can see those posts there. I usually post them Friday or Saturday, and that allows that allows a situation that you can kind of work in your favor a little bit there, to kind of take your see where you got to post and post it there. So all that being said, we thank for everyone for doing that. All you just got to do is leave your picks and do a full 7-round draft, and make sure you follow the rules I give, and you'll have a shot. But speaking of the rules, this week I required you all to pick a wide receiver and a corner, both in the top 3 rounds. No specific order needed, and you can only use 2 trades. So I thought this would be relevant because of what we saw at the combine with both of these positions and how both just had extremely good talent. But I think that's where we're going to be looking at for a while. Want to do this again with those groups together. So without further ado, here's this week's Mock Draft Monday winner, and they followed the rules to the T and got another top position in those top 3 picks. The winner is Dan Meyerhuber, who submitted their picks. And I like the spirit of what Dan did in this draft, because I still think offensive line is such a big priority for this team. They need to control the line of scrimmage to give Kenny Pickett more time or Mason Rudolph more time, but also to plow the road for runners when it comes to Najee Harris and Jalen Warren, and making sure the run game can take over. Those are all the things that I think make a lot of sense for getting a Talisa Fuaga, who Dan picked in the 20th overall pick, an offensive tackle out of Oregon State, who's huge. And I spent a little bit more time with Talisa Fuaga at the combine. I liked what I saw. Again, I'll try to cut up things so that y'all can listen to him and watch him on the stream. But I really like Fuaga. He's massive, he's huge, and somehow still like athletic enough to do all the crazy things that he does. I think that makes a lot of sense, picking him at 20th overall. And that's, again, taking a look at other things too, like which receivers were still going, which corners were still going. Were there other tackles that were missing? I think they got a good idea of I think that's a great idea of Dan, to go after a big, massive offensive tackle who could play right tackle, put Broderick Jones back in the left tackle. And then those two guys are young, physical, dominant presences, along with, with the Steelers situation, James Daniels, Isaac Seumalo. And if they could just fix the center situation, I think that their offensive line is in a really good spot. But let's get off the offensive line real quick. Dan Meyerhuber did a really good job balancing this and made sure to knock out all my requirements in the second and third picks, and doing it with the same school. 51st overall, Roman Wilson, wide receiver we've been talking about. He's the guy that Dan went with. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm starting to wonder though, with Roman Wilson, with what we knew about him as a route runner, and now we're seeing him with the athleticism. I wonder if he's played himself up into that conversation of guys that should be first round pick type players. It's always tough to see that, but I think Roman Wilson is a good fit there. I think there's several other receivers who could fit there, but that's very much to the spirit of what we're doing here. Now, you're probably wondering, or if you're listening, you're probably wondering, well, who did he pick at corner? And if you're sitting there watching this on YouTube, you're like, oh, Mike Sanders still. That makes sense, because that guy can change direction. He's explosive. He's just more of a slot corner. And I think that's where that's where there might have been some miscommunication, or not miscommunication, misunderstanding about when I was talking about corner. Some people were thinking it had to be an outside corner. It doesn't have to be. You get a really good slot corner who can bounce around your defense. That's worth a third round pick right there. So there's options there. So again, Dan did a really good job. I like Roman Wilson. I like Mike Sanders. So I think they would be both good young pieces. Fuaga is another one. I think he might even complete their offensive line. There's a lot of things that work in the Steelers' favor with these early picks here. But I also like some of these later picks here by Dan. For one, you got Cedric Gray, the linebacker out of North Carolina. Met with him at the combine and seemed like a really good sideline to sideline tackler on tape. I liked his demeanor. He also is a big Steelers fan, or was a big Steelers fan. Just growing up, he rooted for the Steelers through a lot of games. He said, I've heard he has a tattoo of Troy Polamalu on his body. That's pretty crazy. But all fandoms aside, I still think Cedric Gray is a good option at linebacker to at least keep an eye on and study. So there's that. But also other picks here by Dan. You had your second, fourth round pick here, Jordan Travis, the quarterback out of Florida State. And then your 197th pick was Delmar Glaze, interior offensive lineman out of Maryland. And you finished up with Xavier Thomas, edge rusher from Clemson, at pick 238. But all in all, I think Jordan Travis is the ideal 4th round quarterback in this draft class, even though he's hurt and he's going to be rehabbing. I think his presence around could be a boost. So, down the line, and if he helps, he helps. If he doesn't, we'll see where it goes from there. But bottom line, I think that this is a good class right here. If the Steelers were to bring these guys in, we see them, have to work and everything. But I just think that this lines up with a lot of the needs that they have right now. Still getting an offensive tackle, but making the next 2 picks those 2 picks. I think that's I think that when you look at that, that's the kind of mix the Steelers could realistically employ. It just makes a lot of sense. You get your line solidified. You probably spent money in free agency on a TV to talk about to kind of get things straight for you guys. I think that's where I look at the Steelers and their draft situation. Again, they have plenty of needs. They have plenty of needs. And in free agency, they'll fix some of them. But they will not be as predictable in this draft period as they have been in previous years. That, I think, is a big part of this. So, again, shout out to Dan Meyer-Huber for winning this the Mock Draft Monday. We appreciate everyone who competed and made sure to submit their picks to let us review over them. Remember, just check out @CarterCritiques on Twitter, or look at the Locked On Steelers Facebook group, and you'll find the options to post your screenshots there. Now, again, as I said, I was in Indy all week long, got there Monday, left Sunday, and I'm back here recording for you guys for the Monday show. There's a lot to break down. I'm going to be working on those. It's going to take some time, but episode by episode, we're going to be going through a lot of this. And so there's a lot to comb through, and not just the interviews, but also the combine numbers and also the tape that I haven't gotten a chance to review. And that's all going to be on our way to developing a complete, Locked On Steelers big board of the top targets they're going to be looking at for their positions. And we'll also be doing other mock drafts, mock draft Mondays, mock draft whenever's, because of, maybe I need to do a mock draft on this show, and we'll keep you up to date with our studies of this draft class as we get you ready for the NFL draft in a bit here. So just want to say thanks for coming along for the ride, guys. It's always great. We'll be back tomorrow here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, talking about your Pittsburgh Steelers. Reminder to find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. And we again will be back tomorrow talking about your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.